She collapsed in the snow on Christmas Eve, and the quiet cowboy carried her home in silence. Snow blew sideways across the open flats as if the whole frontier had turned against anything small enough to be carried by the wind, and the young woman pushed through it with her arms wrapped tight around her chest, her breath breaking in thin white clouds as she tried to keep moving toward the faint lantern lights of the settlement miles ahead. She had been walking since her wagon axle snapped at dusk, since the cold crept into her boots and numbed her toes, since every sound behind her felt like something waiting to swallow her whole. The storm thickened until the world shrank to the few steps in front of her, and her legs trembled under the weight of exhaustion she'd been trying to outrun for far too long. She stumbled once, caught herself on a drift, then stumbled again, and this time didn't rise fast enough. The wind roared over her as she tried to lift her head, but the snow pressed back like a heavy hand, swallowing her breath and sight until she could no longer feel where her fingers ended or the storm began. Somewhere in the white void, she heard hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate. Not the frantic rhythm of a posse or patrol, but the steady cadence of a man who knew how to ride in weather that punished the unprepared. She tried to call out, but her voice cracked into the storm before it formed. The hoofbeats grew louder, stopped just ahead, and a dark shape broke through the snow. A tall cowboy, wrapped in a thick coat dusted white, his hat pulled low, his posture calm in a night that made most men frantic. He swung down from the saddle with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this before, kneeling beside her without a single wasted movement. He didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He only brushed snow from her face with a gloved hand, checking her breath, checking her eyes, reading her condition the way seasoned riders read sky and trail. She tried to speak, but her lips barely shaped sound. He shook his head gently, not to silence her, but to tell her she didn't need to use strength she didn't have. In one smooth motion, he lifted her into his arms, not roughly, not urgently, but with the controlled steadiness of a man who understood how cold steals a person breath by breath if you let panic make a single mistake. He turned toward the pines, where a faint glow flickered through the branches, the promise of shelter. And without a word, he carried her through the storm, the snow closing behind them as if erasing the trail she'd collapsed on minutes before. The cowboy moved through the storm with the kind of sure-footed steadiness that came from years of riding in weather that punished hesitation. His coat snapping in the wind as he adjusted his grip on her just enough to keep her weight balanced without jarring her already stiff limbs. She felt the sway of his steps only faintly, her senses dulled by cold. But she recognized the way his pace never faltered, even when the drift rose past his boots. The faint glow she'd glimpsed earlier grew steadier as they approached the timberline. A single lantern swinging from a hook outside a small, weather-worn cabin, its door reinforced with planks that had seen more winters than she had. He paused beneath the overhang, letting the storm's roar dim before shifting her weight against his chest, long enough to free one hand and lift the latch. The door creaked open, releasing warm air that struck her face like a shock, and he stepped inside with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown on the trail. The cabin was simple. A stove radiating heat, a cot folded neatly against the wall, a table with a tin cup turned upside down, and a stack of firewood waiting near the stove. Everything placed with the precision of a man who lived alone and trusted order more than company. He laid her gently on a thick rug near the stove, not too close to the heat, not too far, then removed his gloves and checked her hands, turning them palm up to gauge how deep the cold had reached. She tried to sit up, but the stiffness in her limbs forced her back down, and he raised a hand, not to stop her, but to tell her she didn't need to push herself yet. Moving with brisk purpose, he filled a kettle from a water bucket, set it on the stove, and tossed a few fresh logs onto the fire. Each motion clean and practiced, as if tending a half-frozen stranger on Christmas Eve was not the strangest thing that had happened to him this year. She watched him through half-open eyes, the edges of her vision still flickering from exhaustion, and noticed how he kept glancing toward the door, checking the storm, checking the woods, making sure whatever danger found her on the flats hadn't followed them into the pines. When the kettle began to hiss softly, he poured a small amount of warm water into a tin cup and knelt beside her again, lifting her head just enough to let her drink. She managed a few swallows, and when her breathing eased, he nodded once. Quiet approval, quiet reassurance, before draping his spare coat over her shoulders, anchoring it with care rather than claim. Christmas Eve might have taken her strength, but it hadn't taken his certainty about what needed to be done. Warmth from the stove slowly pushed back the numbness in her fingers, but the shock of the storm still clung to her breath, making each inhale thin and uneven as she lay where he had set her. The cowboy didn't speak, didn't crowd her with questions, only moved through the small cabin with a quiet efficiency that gave her time to understand she was no longer fighting the snow alone. He checked the kettle again, then poured more warm water into the cup, lowering himself to one knee beside her, the way a man approaches a wounded animal, steady, unhurried, leaving space for fear to loosen its grip. She tried to lift her head, but her muscles weakened under the effort, and before she fell back, he slid a folded blanket beneath her shoulders, adjusting it with slow, measured motions that spoke of someone who had tended frostbite before and knew that sudden heat could harm more than help. She watched him through wavering blinks, uncertain whether he was older or simply weathered by the frontier. But there was nothing harsh in his expression, only focus, the kind that comes from living where mistakes cost more than pride. When he offered the cup again, she managed a few longer swallows, the heat spreading down her throat like a reluctant revival. Her hands trembled when she returned the cup, and he steadied it without touching her skin, guiding it back to the floor with that same quiet control he had shown since finding her in the snow. The storm battered the cabin walls in heavy gusts, rattling the shutters, and each time the wind howled, she flinched, not from the sound, but from the memory of being lost in it. And he turned his head slightly, checking the door, then the window, then her, as though taking inventory of every threat and removing it one by one without speaking. She wanted to ask his name, to explain why she had been on the flats alone on Christmas Eve, but her voice wouldn't form the words. He didn't push for them. Instead, he stirred the fire with a short iron poker, sending a soft amber glow across the room that warmed the edges of her vision and slowed her racing breath. When he finally settled on the floor near the wall, far enough to give her space, close enough to intervene if her condition worsened, she realized the silence between them wasn't empty. It was shelter. It was steadiness. It was the kind of quiet that comes from someone who spends their life listening to storms and surviving them. And in that silence, she understood that this Christmas Eve might not save everything she'd lost, but it had saved her. Heat from the stove seeped slowly into her bones as she shifted beneath the spare coat he'd laid over her, and though strength returned in small, stubborn increments, her thoughts still moved like people wading through heavy snow, slow and unsure of where to step next. The cowboy noticed the change the moment she tried to brace herself on an elbow, rising from his place near the wall and moving toward her with that measured calm that felt more like protection than intrusion. Without touching her, he slid a wood crate closer so she could lean against it, giving her a place to sit upright without exhausting herself. And only when she steadied her breath did he speak for the first time since finding her, his voice low, carrying the dust of long trails and winters survived, asking simply whether she felt her hands and feet again. She nodded weakly, and he studied her face for confirmation rather than trusting the gesture alone. Then poured another cup of warm water, this time adding a pinch of salt from a tin to help her regain what the cold had drained away. She took it with shaky fingers, realizing as she drank that he hadn't asked who she was or why she'd been out there. He was asking first whether she was safe to keep breathing the next hour. When she finally managed to speak, the words came thin and fractured. Her wagon left behind, the broken axle, the long stretch of road where she'd hoped to find help before the storm reached her, the promise she'd been trying to keep on this Christmas Eve, despite having nowhere left to keep it. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady, absorbing each detail the way men of the mountains absorb weather, not judging it, just preparing for what it means next. When she trailed off, he didn't ask for the parts she couldn't say yet, the pieces of her story that sat heavy behind her ribs. Instead, he checked the shutters once more, tightened the latch on the door, and added wood to the stove until its heat filled the room with a firm, protective glow. Her breath eased, but a tremor passed through her shoulders, half from cold memory, half from the strange relief of no longer carrying her own weight alone. The cowboy met her eyes briefly, not with pity or advantage, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had been lost once too, and knew the work it took just to return. Outside, the storm clawed at the cabin, but inside, for the first time in hours, she felt the shape of safety forming around her. The warmth in her limbs flickered back and forth like a hesitant flame, returning in uneven surges that made her shiver even as she sat upright, and the cowboy noticed the tremors instantly, rising with that same instinctive steadiness he'd shown since he carried her through the storm. He moved to a small shelf beside the stove, retrieving a wool blanket that had clearly seen years of winters, shaking it out with a single efficient motion before draping it over her shoulders in a way that kept heat close, but didn't trap her arms. She murmured a quiet apology for the trouble, but he ignored the apology completely. Not unkindly, just in the way of a man who believed survival came before pride, and instead poured a small pot of water into a basin, checking the temperature with his wrist, before kneeling beside her with a folded cloth. He didn't speak as he worked, dipping the cloth into the warm water and gently pressing it against her hands first, letting the heat seep in gradually so she wouldn't feel the painful sting of rushing blood. He waited, patient and unmoving, giving her limbs time to understand they were no longer fighting the cold alone, then moved to her forearms, then her face. Each motion slow and controlled so she never felt startled or trapped. She watched him, unsure whether to thank him or simply accept the help, but his focus never left the task, not on her expression, not on her posture, only on whether her breathing eased and the color returned to her skin. When she winced from a returning pulse in her fingers, he adjusted the cloth temperature without comment, as though tending to a stranger on Christmas night was a duty he'd long prepared for, rather than an unexpected burden dropped at his cabin door. After a while, when her trembling finally settled into a quieter rhythm, he offered her a small tin bowl of broth warmed on the stove, its steam curling upward in soft ribbons, and she cupped it with both hands, realizing she could hold it now without shaking too violently. He stepped back then, not far, just enough to give her space to eat, resting a shoulder against the wall as he kept an unobtrusive eye on her progress, neither hovering nor distancing himself. Outside, wind battered the cabin with the fury of a world determined to swallow the weak. But inside, the simple act of being cared for without condition felt like more warmth than the stove could produce. And as she finished the broth, her breath deepened in a way that told him she was no longer slipping away from the night. The storm outside hammered the cabin harder than before, shaking loose snow from the roof and rattling the shutters in sharp bursts that made the lantern flicker against the walls, yet inside the quiet between them grew steadier, warmer. Shaped by a kind of unspoken understanding neither one needed to name. She sat wrapped in the thick blanket he'd given her, the bowl of finished broth resting beside her boots, her limbs no longer trembling but still heavy with the exhaustion of someone who'd fought too long against a world that rarely offered shelter. The cowboy noticed the weariness in her posture and wordlessly adjusted the stove's damper, softening the heat so it warmed the room evenly without overwhelming her. When the lantern dimmed, she looked toward it with a faint trace of alarm. But before she could reach for it, he crossed the room, lifted the glass, trimmed the wick with 2 practiced motions, and set it back down, restoring the glow with the ease of a man who had kept himself company through many silent winters. She watched him, not out of fear, but because silence forced her to really see him. The rough coat still damp at the hem from carrying her through the snow, the steady hands that moved with purpose instead of hurry, the way his shoulders carried the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. When their eyes met for a brief second, neither looked away in discomfort. Instead, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that the storm outside wasn't the only thing she'd survived tonight. He didn't ask what she had been running from or who had left her alone on Christmas Eve. He only checked the shutters again, tightened the latch, then crouched by the stove to shift the logs, ensuring they'd burn long enough to carry the warmth into morning. As he worked, she reached out instinctively, stopping short just before touching his sleeve, not wanting to impose. But he understood the gesture anyway, and gave a small, reassuring nod. It wasn't permission. It wasn't request. It was simply recognition. 2 people caught in the same night, sharing the same brief refuge. When he finally settled onto the wooden chair near the wall, the cabin fell into a stillness that wasn't empty or strained, but full of the crackling fire, full of the storm fading into the distance, full of the quiet gratitude she didn't yet have the words to express. And in that silence, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she might actually see morning. By the time the first pale hint of dawn seeped through the frost-rimmed window, the storm had softened into a quiet hush, leaving the world outside buried under a smooth, untouched blanket of snow. She woke to the subtle shift of the cowboy rising from his chair, his movements slow, careful not to startle her, though her breath still caught from the cold memory of the night before. He approached the door, unlatched it gently, and stepped outside for only a moment, letting in a stream of icy air that carried the sharp scent of pine and frozen earth. But when he returned, the door didn't close as quickly as it should have. He paused, studying something beyond the threshold with a focus that made her sit a little straighter beneath her blanket. He didn't speak, but she could see tension tighten his posture, a subtle straightening of his back as he stepped aside so she could see the ground just beyond the cabin. There, cutting across the untouched snow, were footprints, fresh, deep, moving toward the woods rather than away from them, as if someone had circled close during the night, watching the cabin while the storm still raged. Her breath hitched, not from cold, but from the weight of possibility. Someone had followed her. Someone had been close enough to the cabin walls that the wind hadn't erased their trail. The cowboy didn't demand explanations or accuse her of bringing danger to his door. He only scanned the tree line with narrowed eyes, his silence sharpening into something protective rather than angry. She tried to stand, but weakness tugged at her legs, and he raised a hand, not stopping her, but reminding her that she didn't need to rise until she could do it without collapsing. He stepped outside again, crouching to inspect the prints more closely, measuring their depth, their direction, the spacing between each step. When he returned, closing the door firmly behind him, she expected fear or frustration. Instead, his voice was calm, edged with certainty. Whoever it was didn't stay long. It should have comforted her, but the shock on her face told him enough. She knew those tracks belonged to someone who hadn't come to offer help. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the blanket, and for the first time since he'd found her, she admitted in a soft, unsteady voice that she hadn't been alone on the flats when the storm began. The cowboy didn't ask who or why. He only nodded once, as if preparing himself for whatever truth she wasn't ready to say aloud yet. The cabin felt smaller after her confession, the air heavy with the knowledge that the storm hadn't been her only threat. And the cowboy reacted with the same quiet decisiveness he had shown all night. Checking the rifle leaning against the wall, verifying the latch on the back window, and scanning the woods through the narrow gap beside the shutter, as if he could read the forest the way other men read newspapers. She tried again to stand, this time managing to stay upright by bracing one hand against the table. But before she could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, just one, like a branch snapping under deliberate weight, not the random break of winter settling. The cowboy moved instantly, stepping between her and the door with a calm that felt more protective than forceful, raising a hand to keep her still. Another sound followed, a low whistle, then the thud of something hitting the snow outside, too heavy to be wind and too intentional to be an animal passing through. Her breath tightened. She recognized that whistle. It wasn't a call, it was a signal. A warning meant for someone else. Or a threat meant for her. The cowboy opened the door only a crack, just enough to see the yard, and in that single sliver of morning light stood a figure at the edge of the trees. Broad-shouldered, coat dark with melted snow, face shadowed by a hat pulled low. He didn't move closer. He only lifted his hand and pointed at the cabin, a gesture that carried more claim than question, then tapped 2 fingers against the knife at his belt, with a deliberate slowness that turned her stomach cold despite the heat of the stove. She felt her knees weaken, and the cowboy caught her elbow, not gripping, not holding her in place, simply steadying her before she fell. Without a word, he shut the door, slid the heavy plank into place, and turned back toward her, his expression no longer just cautious, but resolved. The kind of resolve found in men who have faced danger enough times to know when it has chosen its moment. The pounding of her heart filled the silence, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice cracked around the truth she had been trying not to face. He found me. The cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't demand details she couldn't yet give. He simply reached for his hat, set it on his head with a firm downward pull, and said the only thing she needed to hear. Then he won't take you from here. The stranger's shadow still clung to the cabin door frame like a bruise on the morning light, but the cowboy didn't waste a second on fear or hesitation. He stepped outside with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who had lived long enough in the mountains to know that danger respected resolve more than noise. She followed him only as far as the window, gripping the sill as she watched him walk across the snow toward the tree line, where the man who'd hunted her now waited with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the outcome. The cowboy didn't reach for his rifle or raise his voice. He simply stopped a few yards away, his posture tall and unshaken, the quiet of the morning folding around him until even the pines seemed to hold their breath. The stranger laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cracked through the cold air, and pointed at the cabin again, tapping the knife at his belt, as though reminding both of them why he had come. But the cowboy didn't look back toward the cabin, didn't reveal her position, didn't give the stranger the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Instead, he stepped forward once, the snow groaning under his boots, and spoke in a voice so even it carried like steel. "She's not yours to follow." The stranger's smirk faltered. Men built on intimidation recognized immediately when they had run into someone who couldn't be moved by threats. He barked something crude, something meant to provoke. But the cowboy didn't react, not with anger, not with retreat. He simply shifted his stance, shoulders squared, gaze fixed with the certainty of a man who had drawn invisible lines his whole life and spent years defending them alone. The stranger hesitated, glancing toward the woods for support that wasn't there, and the power in the clearing shifted. Subtle but unmistakable, as if the mountain itself had chosen sides. She watched from the window, her pulse shaking her ribs, and realized the cowboy wasn't just blocking the path. He was publicly naming the truth she had been afraid to voice, that she deserved safety, and someone was willing to stand in plain daylight to say so. When the stranger finally stepped back, muttering under his breath as he retreated into the trees, the tension in her chest loosened with a rush so sharp she had to steady herself. The cowboy didn't chase him or celebrate victory. He only looked once toward the fading tracks, confirming the threat was gone for now, then turned back toward the cabin with the calm of a man who had spoken the mountain's warning and been heard. When the cowboy stepped back into the cabin, shutting the cold and the fading danger behind him, the tension in the room softened as if the very walls exhaled. She stood near the stove with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, trying to steady her breath enough to ask the questions that had pressed against her ribs since the moment she had collapsed in the snow. But he shook his head gently, not dismissing her, just sparing her the weight of reliving what had chased her here before she had enough strength to carry it. Instead, he moved to the stove, pushed another log into the embers, and let the warmth grow until the air felt safe again. She watched him in silence, seeing now what she had missed in her panic the night before. The way his movements revealed a life lived far from noise, a life shaped by danger weathered alone, and yet a life that still left room to protect someone who arrived unannounced on Christmas Eve. When she finally found her voice, it came out soft and unsteady, an apology for the trouble, for the danger she'd drawn to his door. But the cowboy simply set a tin cup of warm water on the table and told her, in the same calm tone he'd used outside, that no one should face a storm or a pursuer alone. No judgment, no pressure, just truth, spoken plainly. Outside, the sun pushed gently over the ridge, turning the snow into a sheet of quiet gold, and she stepped closer to the window, watching the light fill the clearing where fear had stood only minutes earlier. The tracks from the stranger were still visible, but already softening, fading under the slow drift of morning wind. She breathed deeper, feeling, for the first time in months, what a beginning felt like instead of an ending. The cowboy checked the trail once more, not out of worry but out of habit, then nodded toward the small pot of untouched broth warming on the stove, reminding her she needed strength before making decisions about where to go next. She managed a faint smile at that, not because everything was suddenly simple, but because she understood the truth beneath his words. Safety isn't always a place. Sometimes it's just a moment given by someone who chooses to stand between you and the thing that meant you harm. And on this quiet Christmas morning, with the storm behind them and daylight breaking open the sky, that moment was enough. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the West. Before you go, tell me this. If you saw someone stand alone to shield a stranger, would you step beside them? Your voice keeps these stories alive.